The moment Ethan Cole walked through the golden doors of our grand reception hall, I knew everything had to go perfectly. I had spent 6 months building this night. 6 months of encrypted transmissions, back-channel negotiations, carefully worded proposals, sent across 4 relay stations to reach the human diplomatic corps at Arcturus Gateway. 6 months of my life poured into a single evening that would determine whether the Velari kingdom survived the next galactic cycle or burned to ash under Drawthorn warships. My name is Kale Vorath. I have served the Velari crown as senior diplomatic advisor for 31 years, and in all that time, I have never been more afraid than I was that night. Not because of the Dran fleet massing along our border, not because of the dozen allied ambassadors watching from the gallery with their recording devices and their whispered judgments. I was afraid because Princess Ciara Velari, 19 years old, and acting as the crown's representative in her ailing father's absence, had arrived 40 minutes late with wine on her breath and contempt in her eyes. I positioned myself near the central dais where the formal introduction would take place, and watched Ethan cross the hall. He moved the way all experienced human diplomats moved, with a kind of easy confidence that never crossed into arrogance. He was young by galactic standards, barely into his 30s, but the intelligence community files I had studied painted a picture of someone far beyond his years. He had brokered the Marvan peace accords at 24, preventing 2 species from wiping each other out in a war that would have destabilized an entire sector. He had led a relief mission into the Gorath plague zone and nearly died when he contracted the hemorrhagic virus himself. He spoke 11 galactic languages fluently, including our own, which he had learned specifically for this visit, because he believed speaking to someone in their own tongue was the most basic form of respect one being could offer another. He brought a delegation of 5. Humans always traveled light. They did not need entourages of hundreds to project power. Their reputation preceded them like a gravitational field, bending everything in its proximity. I had seen it before, the way a room shifted when humans entered. Other species straightened their postures. Conversations became more careful. There was a gravity to human presence that had nothing to do with their physical size, and everything to do with the collective memory of what they had done for the galaxy over the past 2 centuries. I intercepted Ethan briefly, before the formal proceedings. He shook my hand, which is a human gesture of trust, involving the deliberate exposure of an unarmed palm, and told me he was looking forward to finalizing the defense partnership. His grip was warm and firm. His eyes were steady, the color of deep ocean water on their homeworld. I believed him completely, and that belief made what happened next so much worse. The hall was magnificent that night. Every crystal chandelier was lit, casting prismatic light across the vaulted ceiling. Representatives from the Korvathi Collective, the Palani Trade Federation, the Solani Republic, and 8 other allied powers filled the gallery seats. Their diplomatic aides leaned forward, recording devices active, translating every word into a dozen languages. This was not a private meeting. This was a public declaration of partnership, designed to send a message across the Concord that the Velari kingdom stood with humanity. The Drawn Collective was supposed to see this broadcast and recalculate their invasion timeline. They were supposed to look at the Velari standing shoulder to shoulder with humans and decide that the cost of attacking us had just become unacceptable. That was the plan. That was my plan, built across 6 agonizing months of work that could never be replicated if this evening went wrong. Princess Ciara entered from the upper terrace, descending the ceremonial staircase with 2 of her courtiers flanking her. She wore the formal silver of the royal house, and under other circumstances, she would have looked every inch the future queen she was born to become. But I could see the looseness in her posture, the slight glaze in her violet eyes, and the way she glanced at Ethan's delegation with the kind of casual disinterest that made my stomach clench into a cold knot. She had been briefed. I had personally briefed her 3 separate times. I had given her dossiers on human customs, on Ethan's background, on the critical importance of this alliance. I had explained the drawn threat in terms so explicit that any reasonable person would have lost sleep over them. She had nodded through all of it, the way she nodded through everything, as though the universe were a performance staged for her amusement, and she had already decided it was boring. I blamed myself, partly. I blamed her tutors, who had filled her head since childhood with stories of Velari greatness and never once mentioned the civilizations we depended on. I blamed Valon, her chief courtier, a young fool born into minor nobility who had spent years reinforcing every prejudice Sayara had ever been taught. But most of all, I blamed the simple fact that she was 19 years old, sheltered, untested, and had never once in her life faced a consequence that could not be softened by her title. The formal introduction began. Ethan stepped forward, and the hall fell silent with the particular quality of silence that accompanies moments the galaxy will remember. He offered the traditional human diplomatic gift, a small crystal sphere containing a preserved flower from Earth's botanical archives. It was a lily, white and perfect, sealed in a stasis field that would keep it alive for 1,000 years. Among humans, this gift represented enduring partnership, a living thing protected against time itself, offered as a symbol of commitment that transcended the lifespan of any individual. He had chosen it specifically for the Velari, whose own culture revered botanical symbolism. Our coronation ceremonies involved the planting of trees. Our funeral rites centered on the releasing of seed pods into the wind. He had done his research. He had shown respect in the most precise and thoughtful way possible. He presented the sphere with both hands, spoke the formal words of greeting in flawless Velari, and expressed his hope that this evening would mark the beginning of a bond between their peoples that would outlast the stars themselves. His pronunciation was perfect. His grammar carried the formal register reserved for addressing royalty, which meant he had studied not just the language but the social architecture embedded within it. Ciara looked at the sphere the way one might look at an insect that had landed on a dinner plate. She did not take it. She did not acknowledge the gesture. She did not even look at Ethan's face. Instead, she tilted her head and spoke in clear, carrying tones that reached every corner of that silent hall, every recording device in the gallery, and every relay station that would carry her words to the far edges of the Concord within hours. "How charming," she said. "A weed in a glass ball. I suppose for a species still learning to walk among the stars, this passes for sophistication." She paused, letting the words settle like venom, and I watched her mouth curve into a smile that had no warmth in it. "Tell me, Envoy, does your government truly believe we would entrust our defense to a race so young they still smell of their birth world? Perhaps you should be grateful the Velari are even willing to consider granting you an audience." The silence that followed was the loudest sound I have ever heard. Every ambassador in the gallery stopped breathing. I could see the Korvathi representative's hand freeze halfway to his translation device. The Palani attaché's mouth fell open. A Solani junior diplomat actually stood up from his seat as though some reflex had told him to flee the room before the shockwave hit. Two of Ethan's delegation members stiffened visibly, their jaws tightening with the kind of controlled fury that humans display when they are choosing very carefully what to do next. Ethan did not stiffen. He did not flush or clench his fists or raise his voice. He stood perfectly still for 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, I watched something happen behind his eyes that I will never be able to fully describe. It was not anger, it was not shock, it was not even disappointment, though I think that came later, in private, where no one could see. What I saw was a door closing. Quietly, completely, and without any possibility of being reopened from the outside. It was the look of a man who had arrived with his hands open and his heart willing, and who had just been told, in the most public and humiliating way possible, that his openness was a joke. He lowered the crystal sphere. He placed it gently on the edge of the ceremonial table beside him, treating it with more care than Ciara had shown for anything that entire evening. Then he gave a single, precise nod, the kind a human gives when they have reached a conclusion that requires no further discussion and no further words. He turned around and walked toward the doors. His delegation followed, all 5 of them, moving in synchronized silence, their footsteps echoing across the marble floor like a countdown to something terrible. Not one of them looked back. Not one of them hesitated or glanced at the gallery, or showed any sign that they expected to be stopped. They moved with the certainty of people who had already made their decision and would not be unmade by anything this room had left to offer. I broke protocol. I lunged from my position and caught Ethan at the threshold, my robes tangling around my legs as I moved faster than dignity allowed. My hand closed around his forearm, and he stopped, Not because I had the strength to hold him, but because he was still, even in that moment, too polite to shake off a desperate old diplomat who was watching his life's work crumble. "Envoy Cole," I said, and I could hear the crack in my own voice, like ice fracturing under weight. "Please, she is young. She does not understand what she has done. Give me 1 hour to speak with her, and we can begin again. 1 hour is all I ask." He looked at me, and for a moment, I saw genuine sympathy in his expression. Not pity, which would have been insulting, but real, honest compassion for someone caught in a disaster he had not caused and could not prevent. That was the worst part. He was not punishing us. He was not retaliating. He was not teaching us a lesson. He was simply a man who had been told, clearly and publicly, that his people were not welcome, and he was responding the only way his integrity allowed. "Advisor Vorath," he said quietly, so that only I could hear, "you have always been respectful, and I want you to know that this has nothing to do with you personally." He placed his free hand over mine, a gesture of warmth that nearly broke me. "All further communication should go through formal Concord channels. I wish you well." He walked through the doors. The corridor swallowed him and his people like a closing mouth, and within 20 minutes I received confirmation from our orbital monitoring station that the entire human delegation had boarded their shuttle and departed Velari orbit. Their navigation trajectory pointed toward the Arcturus relay, which meant they were not regrouping at a nearby station or waiting for a callback. They were going home. I stood in that corridor for a long time. Behind me, I could hear Ciara laughing with her courtiers, making jokes about the expression on the human's face when she had spoken. I heard Valen say something about the lily sphere, looking like a toy from a children's market. I heard another courtier suggest that the humans would be back within a week, begging for access to our transit corridors. She did not understand. She could not have understood, because if she had even the faintest grasp of what she had just done, she would have been on her knees begging those doors to open again. In the gallery above, the ambassadors were already transmitting. Their recording devices had captured everything. By morning, every capital in the Concord would know that the Velari crown had publicly humiliated a human envoy. By evening, the consequences would begin arriving like artillery shells, and they would not stop until there was nothing left of us to punish. I leaned my forehead against the cold stone wall and closed my eyes. In 31 years of diplomacy, I had navigated wars, plagues, trade collapses, and palace coups, but I had never faced anything as dangerous as the silence a human leaves behind when he decides you are not worth his time. The next morning, I drove to the human embassy compound in the capital before the first sun had fully risen. I told myself that there might still be a channel open, a junior staffer left behind to manage administrative loose ends, a maintenance worker who could pass a message, anyone, someone I could speak to face and begin the slow, agonizing process of repair. The compound was empty. Not abandoned. Empty. There is a difference that most species do not appreciate until they see it for themselves, but humans understand it instinctively, and they execute it with a precision that borders on art. An abandoned building shows signs of hasty departure, things left behind, doors hanging open, the chaos of retreat. The human embassy showed none of this. Every piece of furniture had been removed. Every terminal had been wiped so thoroughly that our intelligence teams later confirmed even the power usage logs had been zeroed. Every flag had been taken down. Every bracket that held those flags had been unscrewed and packed, and every screw hole in the walls had been filled and smoothed over as though the flags had never existed. The garden in the central courtyard, which the human staff had maintained with a care that always struck me as deeply characteristic of their species, had been precisely trimmed one final time. They had left the plants alive and healthy. They had set the automatic watering system to continue operating in their absence, programmed for the next 6 months. They had even left a small note in Velari script attached to the central fountain, with instructions for the care of each plant species. They had not left in anger. They had left with the meticulous completeness of people who respected the space they had occupied and did not intend to return to it. I stood in that empty courtyard and felt the full weight of what was coming, pressed down on my chest like a planet settling onto my shoulders. Then I drove to the palace to deliver the worst briefing of my career. King Dalen received me in his private chambers. The illness that had been consuming him for the past 2 years had worsened sharply in recent months, a degenerative neural condition that attacked the motor systems and slowly stripped away the ability to move, to speak, and eventually to breathe. His skin, once a deep indigo that carried the luster of the royal bloodline, had faded to a pale lavender. His hands trembled when he reached for his water glass, and the glass rattled against his teeth when he drank. The human medical team that had been scheduled to begin an experimental treatment protocol the following week, a protocol developed specifically for his condition by human neurologists who had spent 2 years studying Veilari physiology, would not be coming. He listened to my report in silence, his eyes, still sharp even as his body failed him, tracked my face with an attention that told me he was reading not just my words but every micro-expression I failed to hide. When I finished, he did not ask me how to fix it. He did not ask me what the humans wanted in exchange for returning. He asked me one question, and his voice carried the terrible clarity of a man who understood exactly what had happened and had already calculated the cost. "How long do we have?" I told him the truth, because Dalen had always demanded truth, even when it was a blade aimed at his heart. The Drawn fleet had been building strength along our border for 8 months. Intelligence reports indicated they had assembled 47 warships, including 3 planet-class destroyers, capable of reducing a continental surface to glass. Our own defense fleet was adequate for patrol duty and minor skirmishes, numbering 19 vessels that had not seen combat upgrades in a decade, because the human engineering contract, the one that was being renewed as part of the partnership Sayara had destroyed, was supposed to handle that. Against a full-drawn assault, we would last perhaps 3 weeks. That estimate assumed optimal conditions, full crew readiness, functional sensor coverage, and no logistical failures. Realistically, given the state of our infrastructure, it might be closer to 2. "And my daughter believes the humans will simply come back," Dalen said. "She does, my king. She does not understand the nature of human withdrawal." "Then you must teach her, Kale, because I no longer have the strength to do it myself, and she must learn before there is nothing left to rule." I found Ciara in the eastern wing of the palace, eating breakfast with 3 of her courtiers, as though it were any other morning. Sunlight streamed through the crystal windows and played across the table, casting rainbow fragments over plates of sweet fruit and steaming grain. She looked up when I entered, and her expression told me she had already classified the previous evening as a minor social incident barely worth remembering. "Advisor Vorath," she said, biting into a sweet fruit. "You look terrible. Did you sleep at all?" "The human embassy is empty," I said. "Every staff member has departed. Every piece of equipment has been removed. Every communication channel has been closed." She shrugged. One of her courtiers, Valen, smirked into his drink, with the confidence of a fool who has never been wrong, simply because he has never been tested. "They will come back," Ciara said. "They need access to our transit corridors for their trade routes. They need our stellarium exports for their medical compounds. We are not some minor colony they can simply walk away from." I pulled up a data projection from my portable terminal and laid it across the breakfast table, scattering plates and cups. Valen's drink spilled across his sleeve. The other courtiers flinched backward. Ciara stared at me with wide eyes, clearly unaccustomed to anyone disrupting her morning routine with anything resembling urgency. "Listen to me carefully," I said, "because your kingdom depends on whether you understand what I am about to tell you." I pointed to the first data column. Human trade routes supply 40% of our medical compounds. You believe they need our transit corridors, but they have 17 alternative routes that bypass our space entirely. Routes they built years ago, at enormous expense. Specifically so, they would never be dependent on any single species for transit access. They do not need our corridors. We need their ships. I pointed to the second column. Human engineering firms maintain our orbital defense grid under a service contract that expired 2 months ago and was being renewed as part of last night's negotiation. The negotiation you destroyed. Without their maintenance crews, we will begin losing satellite nodes within weeks. Each node that goes dark opens a gap in our sensor coverage large enough for a Dran strike fleet to fly through undetected. I pointed to the third column. Human cultural exchange programs bring in tourism revenue that funds 52% of our outer province infrastructure. Roads, hospitals, schools, water treatment facilities. That revenue will stop immediately, because no human tourist will visit a kingdom that called their species primitive on galactic broadcast. Ciara's chewing had slowed. Valen's smirk had faded into something that looked almost like nausea. And the Defense Pact, I continued. The agreement that Envoy Cole was here to finalize. That pact was the only reason the Dran Collective has not already invaded. Their fleet outnumbers ours 4-1. Their technology is a generation ahead of our own. Without human warships standing beside ours, we are not a kingdom to be respected. We are a target to be consumed. Other species will help us, Ciara said, but her voice had lost its certainty. The words came out like a question rather than a statement. They are already leaving. I pulled up the morning dispatches and projected them onto the table one by one, each one landing like a blow. The Torvan hegemony announced 30 minutes ago that they are reconsidering their trade agreements with us. The Alari Syndicate has frozen 3 infrastructure contracts worth more than our annual defense budget combined. The Korvathi and the Palani have both recalled their ambassadors for consultations, which is diplomatic language for deciding whether to sever ties with us entirely. 2 minor allied species I will not bother naming have already withdrawn their embassy staff. I leaned across the table and held her gaze. Do you understand what is happening? Every species in the Concord watched you insult a human envoy on a public broadcast. Now they are all calculating the same equation. If the Velari are foolish enough to humiliate humanity, then the Velari are too foolish to be reliable partners. Not because they agree with the humans, because they know that any species reckless enough to destroy its most important alliance for the sake of a cruel joke is a species that cannot be trusted with anything. Ciara set down her fruit. Her hands were not trembling, not yet, but something behind her eyes had begun to shift. The first hairline fracture in a wall of arrogance that had taken 19 years to build. It was just words, she said quietly. To you, they were just words. To the humans, they were a public declaration that you consider their species inferior, and humans have a very specific response to that declaration. They do not argue. They do not threaten. They do not blockade your ports or bomb your cities, or send assassins to your palace. I straightened and clasped my hands behind my back. They leave, and then you discover what your civilization looks like without them holding it together. Valen opened his mouth to say something, and I turned on him with a fury that startled even me. If you speak, I said, I will have you removed from this palace by the end of the day. You have spent years filling this girl's head with poison about Velari superiority, and the result of your education is standing at our gates in the form of 47 Draughtan warships. So you will sit there in silence, or you will leave and never come back. He sat in silence. Ciara did not defend him. That was the first sign that something had begun to change. Later that evening, the first intelligence report arrived from our border monitoring stations that confirmed my worst fears. The Dran Collective had moved 6 additional warships into the buffer zone, bringing their visible deployment to 53 vessels. Their scout ships had begun active scanning of our outer colony defense networks, probing for the exact gaps I had predicted. The Dran had clearly intercepted the broadcast from the reception, had analyzed the implications with the cold efficiency their species was known for, and had drawn exactly the conclusion I feared. The humans were gone, the Velari were alone, and alone, the Velari were prey. I sent an emergency communique through Concord diplomatic channels that night, addressed to the human diplomatic corps at Arcturus Gateway. I wrote it myself, choosing every word with the precision of a surgeon, acknowledging the insult in specific terms, expressing the Velari crown's deep regret, and requesting a formal audience to discuss a path toward reconciliation. I did not make excuses. I did not minimize. I laid the failure at our feet and asked for a chance to address it. The response arrived 4 hours later. It was 3 sentences long. Your communique has been received and logged by the Human Diplomatic Corps. Your request for audience has been added to the general queue. No timeline for response is available at this time. I read those 3 sentences 7 times, looking for nuance, for subtext, for any sign of an opening I could exploit. There was none. There was no anger in those words, no accusation, no demand, no threat, no invitation to negotiate. Just the flat, procedural language of an institution that had reclassified the Velari kingdom from active partner to general correspondence. We had gone from a priority alliance to a number in a queue, and the polite emptiness of that response was more devastating than any declaration of war could have been. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my office and pulled up every historical case file I could find involving human diplomatic withdrawals. There were 9 documented instances in the last 50 years. 9 species that had driven humans away through insult, exploitation, or betrayal. In every single case, the species that had caused the withdrawal had suffered catastrophic consequences, not because the humans punished them, but because the support systems humans had quietly woven into those civilizations suddenly ceased to function. Trade networks collapsed, medical supply chains dried up, defense arrangements evaporated, infrastructure fell into disrepair, and in every single case, the species had assumed, right up until the moment of collapse, that the humans would eventually come back because they needed the partnership as much as the other side did. They were always wrong. The humans never needed anyone as much as everyone needed them. That was the fundamental miscalculation that every species made, and my princess had just made it in front of the entire galaxy. 2 weeks passed, and the kingdom began to bleed. The orbital defense grid lost its first satellite node on day 3. The human maintenance teams had kept those aging systems running through a combination of engineering brilliance, creative problem-solving, and sheer stubborn refusal to let good infrastructure fail. They had nursed components decades past their expected lifespan, with improvised repairs and custom firmware patches that our own engineers did not understand well enough to replicate. Without them, the nodes began cascading. A power regulator failed on Station 9, which overloaded the backup systems on Stations 7 and 11, which triggered a safety shutdown on Station 14. By day 10, we had lost 3 active nodes, and 2 more were operating at diminished capacity. The gaps in our sensor coverage were wide enough for a Dran strike fleet to slip through undetected, and our engineering teams estimated that repairing even 1 node without human technical support would take 6 months. Medical supply shortages hit the outer provinces first, exactly where the impact would be hardest and the political outcry most difficult to suppress. The human pharmaceutical shipments that had been arriving like clockwork every 30 days simply stopped. Not because the humans were withholding medicine as a punishment, but because the supply contracts had been tied to the partnership agreement that no longer existed. Hospitals in the border colonies began rationing antibiotics. A childhood vaccination program that human doctors had been administering for free across 11 provinces was suspended indefinitely. The provincial governors sent increasingly frantic messages to the capital, each one more desperate than the last, and I had no answers to give them, because there were no answers to give. I sent 7 formal apologies through Concord channels over those 2 weeks. Each one was more detailed, more carefully crafted, more exquisitely worded than the last. I worked on each one for hours, weighing every phrase, testing every formulation against my knowledge of human communication preferences. Each one received the same response: acknowledged, logged, no timeline available. I reached out to every allied species I could think of, calling in favors I had been saving for decades, begging them to mediate on our behalf. The Korvathi ambassador, an old friend named Heron who owed me several substantial favors from a trade negotiation I had helped him navigate years ago, told me bluntly over a secure channel that his government would not get involved. The princess insulted them publicly, Kale, in front of 37 ambassadors and a live Concord broadcast. The repair must be equally public and equally personal. This is not something a third party can broker. You know this. The Polani trade minister said the same thing in different words. The Solani foreign secretary said it in fewer words, but with equal finality. The message was unanimous across every channel I tried. Nobody was going to step between the Velari and the consequences of what Ciara had done, because nobody wanted to risk their own relationship with humanity by being seen as pressuring them to forgive. On day 12, I received an intelligence briefing that changed the calculus entirely. The Dran Collective had moved their primary battle fleet to within 2 days of our border. 53 warships, including 3 planet-class destroyers and a carrier group that our analysts estimated could deploy over 800 attack fighters. Our entire defense fleet numbered 19 vessels, most of them aging patrol cruisers. The mathematics were not complicated. They were simply fatal. I went to the princess. She was different now. The 2 weeks had changed her in small ways that added up to something significant. She no longer ate breakfast with her courtiers. Valen had been quietly dismissed from her presence after she overheard him telling another noble that the human withdrawal was a blessing in disguise that would force the Velari to rediscover their own strength. She had started reading the intelligence briefings herself, something she had never done before in her life, and the dark circles forming under her eyes told me the numbers in those reports were keeping her awake at night the same way they kept me awake. 53 warships, she said, when I showed her the latest deployment map. Her voice was flat, scraped clean of the bravado that had defined her 2 weeks ago. And our defense grid has 3 confirmed blind spots, large enough to fly a destroyer through without detection, I said. We have perhaps 4 weeks before they cross the border. Maybe less, if their scouts have already mapped our sensor gaps, which I believe they have. She was quiet for a long time, staring at the deployment map as though she could change the numbers by force of will. Tell me about him, she said. The human, Cole. So I told her. Not the briefing file version that I had given her before the reception, which she had ignored. The real version. I told her about the Marvin peace accords, how Ethan had spent 9 months living on a space station wedged between 2 hostile fleets, sleeping 4 hours a night, learning 2 new languages from scratch, personally drafting the 14-article agreement that prevented a war that would have killed billions, how the leaders of both sides had initially refused to speak to each other, and how Ethan had spent the first 3 months simply building trust, eating meals with each delegation separately, learning their jokes, remembering their children's names, until the leaders themselves began asking about the other side and wondering if perhaps the young human who ate with them might carry a message. I told her about the Gorath plague zone, how he had volunteered for the relief mission when every other diplomatic team in the Concord had declared the region too dangerous to enter, how he had contracted the hemorrhagic virus on day 6, a disease that liquefies internal tissue, and continued working from his quarantine bed for another 3 weeks because the supply drop coordination system he had designed was too complex for anyone else to operate on short notice, how he had lost 11 kilograms and nearly died before the human medical team that was treating him managed to stabilize the virus. I told her he spoke 11 languages because he believed that speaking to someone in their own tongue was not a diplomatic strategy, but a moral obligation. I told her he had spent 2 months learning Velari before this visit, practicing with language tutors every evening after his regular duties, because he wanted to honor our culture the moment he stepped through our doors. And I told her what he had said to me in the corridor that night, about how this had nothing to do with me personally, about how he wished me well. I told her he had placed his hand over mine with warmth and genuine sadness, and that his eyes had held not anger but grief. He was not angry, I said. That is what you need to understand, Ciara. He was not offended, and he was not punishing us. He was a man who had been told, in front of the entire galactic community, that his people were primitive and unwelcome. And because he believed in the dignity of his species, and the dignity of every person who would serve under the partnership he came to build, he could not stay, because staying would have told his people that their dignity could be traded away for political convenience. Ciara's eyes were wet, and she wiped them quickly, as though ashamed of the moisture. What do I do, Kale? You must go to him. In person. Not through channels. Not through intermediaries. Not through written apologies that any speechwriter could draft in an afternoon. You must travel to human space, stand in front of them, and demonstrate that you understand what you did and why it mattered. Will they listen? I do not know, but I know with absolute certainty that they will not listen to anything less. The next day, King Dalen summoned his daughter. I was present for the conversation, standing by the door in my formal robes, and it was the most painful exchange I have witnessed in 3 decades of service to this family. The king could barely sit upright, his attendants had propped him against cushions, and his breathing came in shallow, labored pulls that made his chest rattle. But his mind was still sharp, and his words carried the weight of a man who knew he might not survive to see the outcome of what he was about to set in motion. "You will go to the humans," he said, "not as a princess, not as a representative of the crown. You will go as a person who has done harm and wishes to make it right." He paused to gather his breath, and the effort of speaking was visible in the way his jaw clenched between sentences. "Kale will accompany you, but he will not speak for you. This is your failure, Ciara. It must be your repair." "Father, I will bring honor back to our name. I swear it on my blood." "I do not care about honor," Dalen said, and the sharpness in his voice made her flinch, as though he had struck her. "Honor is a word we use when we want to feel noble about our mistakes. I care about the people in our outer provinces who cannot get medicine for their children. I care about the families on our border colonies who are looking at the sky and wondering when the drawn warships will come. I care about the thousands of lives that depend on whether you can convince a man you called primitive that you are capable of treating him as an equal. Do not bring me honor, Ciara. Bring me my people's survival." Ciara lowered her head. She said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not have sounded hollow against the truth her father had laid bare. We departed the following morning. I stripped every comfort from the journey deliberately, and Ciara did not resist. No royal cruiser with its silk-lined cabins and its crew of 60. No escort fleet bristling with ceremonial weapons. No attendant staff to manage her wardrobe and prepare her meals. We took a standard diplomatic shuttle with a single pilot, a veteran named Corso, who asked no questions and kept his opinions to himself. The shuttle's interior was bare metal and recycled air, and the engine vibrated beneath our feet with the constant low hum of hardware that functioned reliably without functioning gracefully. Ciara sat in the co-pilot's seat and stared through the forward viewport as we cleared Velari atmosphere. She did not ask for cushions. She did not complain about the temperature. I think, by that point, she understood that the discomfort was not a punishment, but a recalibration. She had spent her entire life wrapped in the soft cocoon of privilege. The metal seat beneath her was the first honest surface she had ever sat on. As we cleared Velari space, Corso noted 3 drawn scout ships tracking along the border parallel to our course. They were not pursuing us. They were just watching, observing the cracks in our perimeter with the patient attention of predators who knew their meal was not going anywhere and there was no rush. Ciara saw them on the sensor display and said nothing, but I noticed her hands grip the armrests of her chair and not let go until the scouts had faded from our scanner range. The journey to human-administered space took 4 days. Ciara spent most of it reading. She had asked me for everything I had on human history, culture, and diplomatic philosophy, and I had given her my entire personal archive, over 3,000 documents accumulated across decades of study. She read for hours at a stretch, her eyes moving across the text with an intensity I had never seen in her before, pausing only to eat or to ask me questions. Some of those questions surprised me with their depth and told me that whatever transformation was happening inside her, it was genuine. "They fought 2 wars that nearly destroyed their own planet," she said on the second day, looking up from a historical summary of the period humans called their 20th century. "Hundreds of millions dead, cities turned to dust, and they still chose to come out here, into a galaxy full of strangers, and offer help. Why would they do that? Because the wars taught them what happens when civilizations treat each other as expendable," I said. "They carry those scars in their collective memory, the way we carry our botanical traditions, woven into every institution and every decision, and they have spent the last 2 centuries trying to make sure no other species has to learn the same lesson the way they did, through fire and ash and the counting of graves." She was quiet after that for a long time, and I saw her turn back to the historical document and read the section about something called Hiroshima 3 more times. On the 4th day, we arrived at the Arcturus Gateway Station. I had visited it twice before, on prior diplomatic assignments, so I knew what to expect. Ciara did not. The station was enormous. It sprawled across a cubic kilometer of space, a lattice of interconnected habitation rings and commercial sectors and docking bays and agricultural domes that housed a permanent population of 2 million beings from 43 different species, all of it designed by human engineers. All of it built by human construction teams working alongside alien labor forces. all of it administered by a human station authority that managed the most complex multicultural environment in the Concord, with the kind of smooth, invisible efficiency that the Velari had never achieved even in our own capital city. Ciara pressed her face close to the viewport as we approached, and she stared at the station's spiraling architecture with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It was the look of someone whose internal map of the universe had just been revealed as catastrophically incomplete. "This is one station," she finally said. "One of 17 in this sector alone," I replied. "Humans maintain over 200 stations across Concord space. Each one operates at a profit. Each one provides services, medical, educational, commercial, humanitarian, to all surrounding systems. And each one was built because a human somewhere looked at a region of space and decided it needed a place where different species could come together safely, trade fairly, and resolve their differences without weapons." We docked at Bay 17 and were met by a junior liaison officer named Owen Price. He was young, perhaps 25, with a pleasant face and an efficient manner that suggested he processed dozens of arriving delegations every week, which he probably did. He scanned our identification documents, ran a brief security check, asked if we had any dietary requirements or environmental preferences, and assigned us quarters on Deck 42. He was friendly. He was professional. He was completely, devastatingly ordinary. He did not mention the incident. He did not treat us with hostility or suspicion. He treated us like any other visitors to the station, with the same courteous efficiency he would have shown to a trade delegation from the Korvathi, or a Palani merchant crew, or a family of Gorath refugees seeking medical treatment. And I watched Ciara's face as she realized that this was the point. She was not special here. She was not a princess whose whims and moods shaped the behavior of everyone around her. She was a guest in someone else's house, and the house was so vast and so busy, and so full of people with their own urgent concerns, that her presence barely registered as a ripple on its surface. "How long before we can meet with someone from the diplomatic corps?" I asked Owen as he led us to our quarters. He checked his schedule tablet with the practiced efficiency of someone who managed a very full calendar. "I can submit a priority request today. Current queue time for non-emergency diplomatic audiences is 8 to 12 days, but given the nature of your visit, I might be able to expedite it to 5 or 6. The Solani trade renewal is in final negotiations this week, and there is a humanitarian situation in the Gorath sector that has pulled most of our senior staff, but I will flag your request as time-sensitive and see what I can do." 8 to 12 days, Ciara repeated. "We handle a lot of traffic," Owen said apologetically, and his apology was genuine, not condescending. He was not rubbing our faces in the wait. He was simply explaining the reality of an institution that served hundreds of species and could not rearrange its priorities every time a new crisis walked through the door. "But I will do my best to move things along for you." He left us at our quarters, which were comfortable but modest. 2 small sleeping rooms, a shared living area with basic amenities, and a window overlooking the station's central commercial district, where thousands of beings from dozens of species moved through markets and walkways and garden corridors in a constant flow of organized, peaceful activity. Ciara stood at that window for a very long time. Finally, she spoke without turning around. "He called it a queue, Kale. We are in a queue." "Yes. And the Gorath humanitarian situation he mentioned, that is the plague zone, where Cole nearly died." "Yes. The humans are still there, still helping the Gorath. Even after everything that happened, even after my insult, they are still running relief missions into a plague zone for a species that is not their own." "Yes, Ciara. That is what humans do. They do not stop helping one species because they are angry at a different species. Each relationship stands on its own terms. Each commitment is honored independently. It is one of the reasons the galaxy cannot afford to lose them. And it is one of the reasons that losing their trust is so devastating. Because when they withdraw from you, everyone around you can see that the problem is not with them, the problem is with you." She pressed her forehead against the glass. The lights of the commercial district reflected in her eyes like scattered stars. "And I called them primitive," she whispered. I said nothing. She did not need me to confirm what she already knew. The days that followed were the most important of Ciara's life. though she did not fully realize it while they were happening. With no meetings to attend, no schedule to keep, and nothing to do but wait, I suggested we explore the station. Ciara agreed, and I think she expected a guided tour with diplomatic handlers and carefully curated exhibits, designed to impress visiting dignitaries. Instead, I took her through the station's ordinary corridors and let her see what humans built when no one important was watching. Our first stop was the medical ward on Deck 19. It occupied an entire ring section of the station, a sprawling facility with treatment rooms, surgical theaters, rehabilitation centers, and long-term care wards, all staffed by human doctors and nurses, working alongside medical professionals from a dozen other species. I brought Ciara to the refugee treatment wing, where Gorath survivors of the hemorrhagic plague were receiving ongoing care, many of them years into recovery from a disease that had nearly exterminated their civilization. A human nurse named Claire Denning was on shift when we arrived. She was perhaps 40, with tired eyes that had seen too much suffering and gentle hands that had learned never to flinch from it. She was changing bandages on a Gorath child whose skin was still mottled with the distinctive scarring the virus left behind, patterns of raised tissue that would mark him for life. The child was afraid, whimpering softly and pulling away from her touch, and Claire spoke to him in his own language, a guttural, clicking tongue that most non-Gorath species found impossible to learn, murmuring reassurances and making him laugh with what sounded like a joke about a clumsy bird. Ciara watched from the doorway, and I watched her watching. Her face was very still. When Claire finished and noticed us standing there, she smiled and asked if we needed directions or if someone was looking for medical attention. "Are you paid for this?" Ciara asked. Claire looked puzzled by the question. "I am a nurse. This is my job." "No, I mean, are the Gorath paying for this treatment? Is there a contract between your government and theirs? A trade agreement? Some arrangement where they provide something in return?" Claire's expression softened in a way that told me she understood exactly who Ciara was and why she was asking these particular questions. "No, Your Highness. The Gorath cannot afford to pay for anything right now. They lost 70% of their infrastructure during the plague. Most of their government collapsed. We treat them because they are sick and we can help. That is the only equation that matters." Ciara left the medical ward without speaking. I walked beside her through 3 corridor sections, our footsteps echoing on the polished station floor, before she found her voice again. "How many patients are in that ward?" "Approximately 400 at any given time," I said. "The station treats over 12,000 patients per cycle across all its medical facilities. The refugee wing alone handles species from 9 different civilizations that are currently experiencing crises of one kind or another. Not all of those species have alliances with humanity. Not all of them are even friendly toward humans. They are treated anyway." We visited the engineering bay next. A team of human technicians was rebuilding a Polani transport vessel that had suffered catastrophic damage in a navigational accident near the station. The Polani crew stood to one side, watching with a mixture of gratitude and transparent amazement as the humans disassembled and reassembled propulsion systems with a speed and precision that bordered on artistic. I spoke with the lead engineer, a broad-shouldered man named Derek Hawkins, who had grease on his hands and a cheerful grin that seemed permanently welded to his face. "We charge for materials only," Derek told me. "Fuel cells, hull plating, conductor wire, that kind of thing. The labor is free." "Why?" Ciara asked. Derek looked at her as though she had asked why water was wet. "Because their ship broke, and they are a long way from home. What else would we do? Charge them a fee and let them drift until they could afford to pay? They have children on board." On the 3rd day, I took Ciara to the education center on Deck 31. Calling it a school does not capture the scope of what humans had built here. 12 classrooms, each one equipped with custom environmental controls to match the atmospheric preferences of the student species inside. Each one taught by human volunteers who had undergone years of training in xenolinguistics, developmental psychology, and species-specific pedagogy. These were not career educators looking for exotic postings. They were humans who had chosen to spend years of their short lives learning how alien children think and grow, so they could teach them properly. We stood in the back of a classroom where a woman named Hannah Morris was teaching stellar navigation to a mixed group of Palani, Korvathi, and Solani children. She was young, perhaps 28, with an energy that seemed to fill the room like sunlight, and a voice that could shift between three alien languages mid-sentence, without losing the thread of what she was explaining. The children adored her. I could see it in the way they leaned forward when she spoke, the way their hands shot up when she asked questions, the way one small Korvathi child reached for her sleeve when she walked past, just to touch her, just to confirm that this warm, bright person was real and would still be there tomorrow. Ciara watched for 20 minutes without moving. When we left the classroom and the door closed behind us, she was crying. "They are not primitive," she whispered. "They are the most advanced species in the Concord, and they do not even realize it, because their definition of advancement has nothing to do with ships or weapons or territory. It has to do with this. Children who are not their own, in classrooms they built with their own hands, taught in languages they spent years learning. They realize it," I said gently. "They simply do not feel the need to announce it. And that is perhaps the most important difference between their species and every other civilization in the galaxy." On the afternoon of the fourth day, I took her to the memorial corridor on Deck 7. It was a long hallway, 300 meters of polished stone, lined with plaques. Each plaque bore the name, image, and service record of a human who had died while working in service to another species. There were hundreds of names. Engineers killed in construction accidents on alien worlds they had traveled to voluntarily. Doctors who had contracted lethal diseases while treating outbreaks among species whose biology they had spent years studying. Soldiers who had fallen defending borders that were not their own, against threats that would never have reached Earth. Diplomats who were caught in crossfires while negotiating ceasefires between species who hated each other more than they feared the cost of war. Ciara walked the entire length of the corridor. She read every name. She looked at every face. Some of them were smiling in their images, the kind of smile humans wear when they have found something worth doing with their finite time. She stopped at one plaque near the end of the corridor. It bore the image of a young woman named Lily Ashford, barely 20 years old, with dark hair pulled back from a face that still carried the softness of adolescence. She had died during a rescue operation on a Gorath mining colony when a tunnel collapsed on top of the evacuation team she was leading. She had been the last one out because she had gone back for a Gorath worker who was trapped under a fallen beam. She freed the worker. The ceiling came down before she could follow him to safety. "She was younger than me," Ciara said. "Yes. She died saving someone she had never met, from a species that was not her own, on a world that was not her home, in a tunnel that she had entered knowing it could collapse at any moment." "Yes." Ciara placed her hand flat against the plaque. Her fingers traced the engraved letters of the young woman's name, and she stood there for a long time, breathing slowly, her face turned away from me so I could not see what was written on it. When she finally lowered her hand and turned to face me, the transformation was complete. The last traces of the girl who had laughed in the grand reception hall were gone. In their place was something harder and clearer and infinitely more honest. It was the face of someone who had looked into a mirror and seen, not the princess she had been told she was, but the person she had actually been, and who had decided that person was no longer acceptable. "I need to speak with them, Kale. Not because our kingdom needs their help. Because I owe them something that cannot wait any longer." The next morning, Owen Price informed us that our meeting had been arranged. We were escorted to a conference room on Deck 3, the diplomatic level, where 3 senior officials of the Human Diplomatic Corps waited for us at a simple wooden table. They introduced themselves. Counselor Diana Holt, a silver-haired woman, with sharp eyes, and a reputation across the Concord for being the principal architect of humanity's integration strategy, the mind behind the policy framework that determined how humans engaged with other species. Commander Lena Marsh, a military attaché whose calm demeanor concealed the kind of strategic intelligence that had planned the defense of 6 allied systems against hostile incursions. And Dr. Philip Grant, a cultural liaison who had spent 15 years studying galactic diplomatic customs and who, I later learned, had specifically requested to be part of this meeting because he believed in the possibility of genuine change. Diana Holt spoke first. She was courteous, but direct in a way that left no room for diplomatic evasion. Princess Ciara, we appreciate you coming in person. Before we begin, I want to be clear about why we responded the way we did, because I suspect there may be a perception in your government that we were punishing the Velari kingdom, and that is not accurate. Ciara nodded. She was sitting straight in her chair, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on Diana's face, with an attention and a focus I had never once seen her give to anyone in all the years I had known her. When an acting head of state publicly degrades a human envoy, Diana continued, it sends a message to every species in the Concord that humans can be disrespected without consequence. If we allow that message to stand, it undermines every partnership we have built, every defense pact, every trade agreement, every humanitarian mission. Because every species will begin calculating whether they too can mistreat our people and still receive our support. I understand, Ciara said. We have received your formal apologies, Lena Marsh added. 7 of them. They were well written, diplomatically appropriate, and legally sound. But written apologies cost nothing. Anyone with a competent speechwriter can produce words of regret. Diana leaned forward. What we need to know, Princess, is whether you understand why what you did was harmful. Not to Envoy Cole personally. He has weathered far worse from species who later became close allies. But to the principle of mutual respect that holds the Concord together. Because that principle is not a luxury. It is the foundation. And when someone in your position cracks that foundation publicly, the entire structure shudders. There was a pause. Ciara looked at me, and I gave her nothing. No nod of encouragement, no guiding glance. This was her moment, and it had to belong to her alone. I have spent 4 days on this station, Ciara said. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the rawness beneath it, the sound of someone speaking not from a script, but from a wound. I have seen your nurses treat dying children for free. I have seen your engineers rebuild ships for people who cannot pay. I have watched your teachers educate children from species that are not your own, in languages that are not your own, in classrooms you built with your own hands, because you believe every child in this galaxy deserves to understand the stars. She paused, and when she continued, her voice was thick but unbroken. I called your people primitive. I said they smelled of their birth world. I said those things because I was raised to believe the Velari were superior. And I never once questioned that belief, until I walked through this station and saw what your people build when no one important is watching them. The 3 officials exchanged a glance. Philip Grant's expression shifted visibly, a softening around the eyes that told me her words had reached him in the place where policy yields to something more personal. Diana Holt spoke again. We have a proposal, Princess. It is not a condition, and it is not a punishment. Think of it as a path forward. She folded her hands on the table. We would like you to spend 3 days working as a volunteer in our humanitarian corps here on the station. You would work alongside our people, doing the same tasks they do, under the same conditions, with no special treatment or royal accommodation. At the end of those 3 days, if you still wish to continue this conversation, we will be here to listen. But only if the words you bring us come from understanding, not from political necessity. I accept, Ciara said without hesitation, and the speed of her answer seemed to surprise even Diana. I would have accepted, even if there were no crisis at home. I think I owe your people far more than 3 days. Philip Grant smiled. Diana Holt's expression did not change, but I thought I saw something shift behind her careful diplomatic mask. Not warmth, not yet, but the first acknowledgement that this young woman might be capable of earning it. The 3 days were the hardest of Ciara's life. She worked 12-hour shifts in the medical ward, following Claire Denning and the other nurses through rounds that left her physically exhausted and emotionally hollowed out. She changed bandages on wounds she had never imagined. She cleaned and sterilized equipment whose purpose she had to learn on the spot. She carried supply containers that weighed nearly as much as she did through corridors that seemed to stretch on forever. And she sat beside patients who were too sick or too frightened to be left alone, holding their hands, speaking to them in whatever fragments of their languages she could manage, staying with them through the long, dark hours, because Claire had told her that no one should ever have to suffer alone. She did not complain. She did not ask for breaks or special consideration. She worked with a focus and a seriousness that surprised even me, and when I checked on her at the end of her first shift, I found her sitting on the floor of the supply room, her back against the wall, her scrubs stained with fluids she could not have identified 12 hours earlier, crying silently into her hands. Not from exhaustion, from understanding. On the second day, she was assigned to the long-term care ward, where elderly refugees from various galactic crises spent their remaining days under human supervision. It was there that she met a Fenari scholar named Torvan, an old man whose hands shook with palsy and whose eyes still carried the haunted, distant look of someone who had watched his civilization collapse from the inside. The Fenari Republic. I had told Sayara about them during our journey, but hearing the story from a briefing document is not the same as hearing it from someone who lived through the fall. Torvan had been a professor of interstellar economics at the Fenari Capital University, a respected academic with tenure and published works and a comfortable life that he had assumed would continue indefinitely. 12 years ago, a Fenari trade minister had insulted a human envoy during a contract dispute, calling humans greedy opportunists who contributed nothing of value to the Concord. The humans withdrew their presence. Torvan described what happened next with the analytical precision of a scholar and the lingering pain of a survivor who would never fully recover from what he had witnessed. It was not sudden, he told Ciara, his papery voice carrying the cadence of a man who had told this story before and would tell it again to anyone willing to listen. That is what people misunderstand. They imagine a catastrophe, an explosion, a single moment of collapse, but it was nothing like that. It was gradual, like bleeding from a wound you cannot see. The trade networks unraveled first. Slowly, quietly, like threads being pulled from a garment. Then the medical supply chains. Then the infrastructure maintenance contracts. Each one had seemed small on its own, a minor convenience, an optional service, a nice-to-have partnership that we could surely manage without. But together they were the skeleton that held our civilization upright, and when the skeleton was removed, piece by piece, we discovered that we were nothing but soft tissue waiting to fall. "Do you blame the humans?" Sayara asked. Torvan shook his head slowly. "No, child. No. They were the foundation we did not know we were standing on. When we pushed them away, we did not fall because they pushed back. We fell because there was nothing left to hold us up. The humans did not destroy the Fenari Republic. We destroyed ourselves the moment we decided their kindness was weakness, and their generosity was something to be mocked." Sichara sat with Torvan for 3 hours that afternoon. She listened to him describe the collapse of the Fenari education system, the failure of their medical infrastructure, the economic implosion that turned thriving cities into refugee camps within 2 years. She listened to him describe the day he left his home for the last time, carrying nothing but his research files and a photograph of his family, boarding a refugee transport that took him to this station, where humans, the same species his government had insulted, took him in and gave him a bed and medical care and dignity. When she finally left his room, she did not speak to me for the rest of the evening. She sat in our quarters and stared at the wall with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It was the look of someone who has seen themselves clearly for the first time in their life and is trying to reconcile the person they thought they were with the person they actually have been. On the third day, she worked in the engineering bay alongside Derek Hawkins and his team. They treated her the same way they treated everyone, with easy humor, patient instruction, and absolutely no deference to her title. They taught her how to calibrate a plasma conduit and laughed when she cross-threaded a connector on her first attempt. They shared their lunch with her and told her stories about their families back on Earth and the colony worlds, about children learning to walk and partners who sent video messages across light years and elderly parents they called every week, even though the transmission delay made conversation feel like shouting into a canyon. They asked her about the Velari homeworld and seemed genuinely interested in her answers. Not diplomatically interested, personally interested. They wanted to know what the forests looked like, and whether it was true that Velari sunsets turned the sky 3 different colors, and whether the sweet fruit she mentioned was anything like the mangoes they grew in their home regions. At the end of her shift, Derek clapped her on the shoulder with one grease-stained hand and said, You did good today, kid. Same time tomorrow if you want. She stared at him. I do not think anyone in her entire life had ever called her kid. Then she laughed, and it was the most honest, unguarded sound I had heard from her in the entire time I had known her. That evening, Ciara told me she was ready to speak with the council again. But before the meeting could be arranged, someone else found her first. She was sitting alone in the observation lounge on Deck 12, a vast room with a transparent wall that looked out onto the star field beyond the station. The lights in the lounge were dimmed, and the stars burned in the darkness like scattered embers, ancient and silent, and completely indifferent to the small dramas being played out on the metal structures floating among them. I was in the corridor outside, giving her space, when I saw a figure approach and sit down in the chair beside her. I recognized him immediately. The steady posture, the quiet confidence, the way he moved through a room as though he belonged in every corner of it. Ethan Cole. He did not announce himself. He did not clear his throat, or stand on ceremony, or wait for her to acknowledge his presence. He simply sat down beside her and looked out at the same stars she was watching. He was wearing civilian clothes, not a diplomatic uniform, and he carried no datapad or official insignia. He had not come as an envoy, or a representative, or a symbol of human institutional power. He had come as himself. I stayed in the corridor. This was not my conversation. Ciara recognized him and immediately began to stand, her body language shifting into the rigid posture of someone preparing to deliver a formal address that she had been rehearsing in her head for days. Ethan raised one hand in a gentle stopping gesture. "Please," he said, "sit. This is not a meeting." She sat. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The stars turned slowly beyond the glass, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who both knew what needed to be said, and were giving it room to arrive on its own terms. "I owe you an apology," Ciara said. "Not a diplomatic one, a real one." Ethan nodded. "I know. But before you give it, I want you to understand something that might change the shape of it." He turned to look at her, and his expression was open and honest, in a way that I have come to believe is uniquely human. "I was not offended by what you said to me in your reception hall." Ciara blinked. "You were not?" "No. I have been called far worse by species who later became humanity's closest friends. Words spoken from ignorance are not the same as words spoken from malice, and I could see that yours came from a place of not knowing, rather than a place of cruelty. You were not trying to hurt me. You were repeating what you had been taught to believe, and that is a different kind of failing." "Then why did you leave?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with the care I had come to associate with humans at their most serious. When they took time before speaking, it was not hesitation, it was precision. "Because you were not just speaking to me," he said. "You were speaking as the acting head of the Velari Kingdom, in front of 37 ambassadors and a live Concord broadcast. And what you said, regardless of your intent, told every species watching that the Velari crown considers humans to be lesser beings." He paused. "I was about to sign a defense pact that would commit human soldiers and engineers to the protection of your kingdom. Some of them would have been stationed on your border. Some of them would have fought the Dran. Some of them would have died. And I could not, in good conscience, send my people to bleed and die for a kingdom whose ruling heir had just declared them primitive and unwelcome in front of the entire galaxy. It was not punishment, Ciara. It was protection of the people I am responsible for. I could not ask them to serve under a banner that held them in contempt." Ciara was silent for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was thick with something that went deeper than regret. "I met a Fenari scholar here, Torvan. He told me that the Fenari did not fall because your people pushed them. They fell because your people were the only thing holding them up, and they were too proud and too blind to see it until there was nothing left to save." "Torvan is a wise man," Ethan said. "I visit him when I can. He has taught me more about the consequences of failed diplomacy than any textbook or training program ever could." "I have been working in your medical ward," Ciara continued, and the words came faster now, spilling out of her as though a dam had broken. "I watched a nurse named Claire hold a dying Gorath child's hand for 6 hours straight, because she said no one should die alone. I watched your engineers fix a Pilani ship for free, because the crew had children on board, and Derek said, "What else would we do? Let them drift?" I watched a teacher named Hannah speak 3 alien languages in one lesson to make sure every child in her classroom understood the stars. And I stood in your memorial corridor and read the name of a girl younger than me who went back into a collapsing tunnel to save a stranger she had never met. She turned to face Ethan fully, and her eyes were wet, but her voice was iron. "I do not deserve your help. My kingdom does not deserve your help, but my people do. The families on our border colonies, who are watching the sky for Drossen warships every night, do. The patients in our hospitals who cannot get medicine do. The children in our schools who have never insulted anyone, and never would do, and I swear to you, on my name and on my crown, and on every ancestor whose blood runs through me, that I will spend the rest of my life making sure no Velari ever forgets what humans are." She paused and took a breath that shuddered on the way in. "I am not going to ask you to forgive me. I do not think forgiveness is the right word for what happened between us. You were not hurt. You were disrespected, and disrespect is not something you forgive. It is something you disprove through action, through years of action, through a lifetime of proving that the person who spoke those words no longer exists. So that is what I am offering you. Not an apology that fades, a commitment that does not." Ethan studied her face for a long time. The stars moved behind him, cold and ancient, indifferent to the weight of the moment unfolding in their light. Then he extended his hand, palm open, fingers relaxed. The same gesture of trust and partnership that he had offered in the grand reception hall on the night she had thrown it back in his face. "Then let us start again," he said. Ciara took his hand. She held it with both of hers and gripped it tightly, and she did not let go for a long time. The following day, the Human Diplomatic Corps formally reinstated communication with the Velari Kingdom. A new delegation was assembled to accompany us back to Velari space and resume negotiations on the Defense Pact. Ethan himself would lead it. But before we departed, Ciara did something I did not expect, something that I later learned had never been done before in the history of the Galactic Concord. She requested access to the station's public broadcast system. Owen Price arranged it within the hour, and Ciara stood in a small recording studio on Deck 5 and addressed the entire Concord. No script, no teleprompter, no speechwriter's careful phrasing. She stood in front of the camera wearing the same simple clothing she had worn during her volunteer shifts, without royal insignia or diplomatic regalia or any of the symbols that had defined her entire life, and she spoke from the place where those symbols had once been. She told the Concord what she had done. She described the insult in her own words, without softening, without context, without excuse. She said she had spoken from ignorance fed by arrogance, and that the combination of those two failings had nearly cost her people their survival and their sovereignty. Then she told the Concord what she had seen: the medical ward where human nurses treated dying refugees for nothing, the engineering bay where human technicians fixed strangers' ships because the alternative was unthinkable, the school where human teachers loved other species' children as though they were their own, the memorial corridor where hundreds of human names were carved into stone, each one marking a life spent and ended in service to someone else's civilization. She described Claire and Derek and Hannah by name. She described Torvon and what he had taught her about the Fenari collapse. She described the plaque of Lily Ashford, the 20-year-old rescue worker who had died saving a stranger in a collapsing tunnel. "I called the humans primitive," she said, looking directly into the camera with eyes that did not flinch. "I said they still smelled of their birth world. I want every species watching this broadcast to know that I was wrong. Not mistaken, not misinformed. Wrong, in the deepest and most fundamental way a person can be wrong about another living being. I looked at the most extraordinary civilization in our galaxy, and I saw nothing, because I was too proud and too sheltered and too lazy to open my eyes." She paused, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice did not waver. The humans did not retaliate against us. They did not threaten us, or blockade our ports, or use their power to humiliate us in return. They simply left, and in their absence, we discovered what our kingdom truly was without them: fragile, vulnerable, incomplete. And when I came to them to ask for their return, they did not make me beg. They did not demand tribute, or concessions, or territory. They asked me to understand. They asked me to work beside their people and see them as they truly are. And what I found was not a primitive species learning to walk among the stars. I found a species that has been carrying the rest of us on its back since the day it arrived in this galaxy, and I found that most of us, myself chief among them, have been too arrogant to notice. She straightened her shoulders. I am Princess Sayara Velari, and I am telling every civilization in this concord the truth that the Fenari learned too late, and that my kingdom nearly learned at the cost of everything we hold dear. The humans are not a convenience. They are not a resource to be exploited, or a service to be taken for granted. They are the reason most of us are still standing, and any species that does not treat them with the respect they have earned is not just foolish, they are dangerous. Dangerous to themselves, dangerous to their people, and dangerous to the fabric of cooperation that holds our galaxy together. The broadcast ended. Within hours, it had been viewed by an estimated 6 billion beings across 42 systems. Within days, 3 species that had been involved in simmering disputes with humanity quietly resolved their disagreements. The Korvathi ambassador sent Sayara a personal message, calling her address the bravest act of diplomacy he had witnessed in 40 years of service. Even the Polani trade minister, who was not known for sentiment, sent a formal commendation. We returned to Velari space with Ethan's delegation aboard a human diplomatic cruiser, a vessel called the Canterbury that was larger than any ship in the Velari defense fleet, and moved through space with the quiet authority of something that had nothing to prove. The journey took 3 days, and during those days Sayara and Ethan spent hours in conversation, not about treaties or defense pacts or the mechanics of interstellar politics, but about their peoples, their histories, their hopes for what the galaxy could become if enough civilizations chose cooperation over domination. I watched from a respectful distance and saw something I had rarely witnessed in my long career, a genuine friendship forming across species lines, built not on political necessity, but on mutual understanding, earned through honesty and pain. When we arrived at the Velari border, the Dran Collective's reaction was immediate, decisive, and deeply satisfying. Their long-range sensors detected the Canterbury's signature, and within 6 hours of our arrival, the Dran fleet began withdrawing from the buffer zone. Ship by ship, formation by formation, they pulled back from the positions they had spent weeks occupying, retreating to their own space, with a haste that told me their commanders understood exactly what the presence of a human cruiser meant. Within 24 hours, every Draydon warship had crossed back over the border. Their fleet commander sent a single transmission to Velari Command, and I will carry its brevity in my memory for the rest of my life. We did not realize the humans still stood with you. Our dispute is tabled. Not a single shot was fired. Not a single ship was damaged. Not a single life was lost. The most devastating military threat the Velari kingdom had faced in a century was neutralized entirely by the presence of one human cruiser and the statement it represented. Humans call this concept deterrence, and it is the most elegant form of power I have ever encountered. They did not need to fight. They did not need to threaten or posture or deploy their weapons. They simply needed to be there, standing beside us, and the galaxy rearranged itself around that fact. The Defense Pact was signed 4 days later, in the same grand reception hall where the insult had occurred. The crystal chandeliers burned with the same light. The gallery held many of the same ambassadors, but the room felt different, because the person standing at its center was different. Ethan presented a new diplomatic gift, another crystal sphere, but this time containing not a lily, but an oak sapling, a tiny tree that humans consider a symbol of strength, growing from small and humble beginnings. He explained that oaks on Earth can live for 1,000 years and grow from seeds so small they fit in the palm of a child's hand. He said he hoped the partnership between their peoples would grow the same way, from something small and fragile into something that could weather any storm. Ciara accepted it with both hands, and a bow that went deeper than protocol required. She held the sphere against her chest and spoke words of gratitude that I know she meant with every fiber of her being, because they were the same words she had practiced quietly in our shuttle on the ride home, whispering them to herself over and over until they felt true enough to say out loud in front of the galaxy. Human medical teams returned to the palace the following week. King Dalen's treatment began immediately, overseen by a neurological team that worked 16-hour shifts for the first month, calibrating the experimental protocol to his specific physiology, with a dedication that went far beyond professional obligation. Within a month, the king was standing. Within 3 months, he was walking the palace gardens under his own power, his hands steady, his color returning, his voice strong enough to carry across a council chamber. He told me once, during an evening walk through the garden, where the oak sapling now grew in a place of honor, that he owed the humans 2 debts he could never repay. The first was his life. The second was his daughter. I have spent 31 years navigating the currents of galactic diplomacy. I have watched wars begin and end. I have seen empires rise in triumph and crumble into dust. I have negotiated with tyrants and idealists, with conquerors and peacemakers, with species so different from my own that finding common ground required inventing entirely new frameworks of communication. But the most powerful thing I have ever witnessed was not a fleet, or a weapon, or a treaty. It was a young human who responded to cruelty with silence, who turned his back with dignity instead of anger, who refused to argue or retaliate, or demand satisfaction, and who simply waited, with the patient confidence of a species that has learned the hardest lessons the universe has to teach, for understanding to arrive on its own terms. And the second most powerful thing I have ever witnessed was a young princess who was brave enough to stand in the ruins of her own arrogance and rebuild herself from the foundation up. Not because she was forced to, not because her kingdom was threatened, but because a nurse held a dying child's hand, because an engineer fixed a stranger's ship, because a teacher loved children who were not her own, and because a scholar in a refugee ward told her the truth she needed to hear in words she could not ignore. Humans do not conquer, they do not subjugate, they do not demand worship or tribute or submission. They build things, they fix things, they teach and heal and show up when no one else will, and when you push them away, they do not push back. They simply leave, and they let you experience the universe without them. That is the most terrifying power in the galaxy. Not the power to destroy, not the power to dominate, the power to simply not be there. Because every species eventually discovers, some gracefully and some through catastrophe, that the universe without humans in it is colder and darker and emptier than anyone ever imagined it could be. I know this because I watched it happen to my kingdom in the space of 2 weeks, and I watched it unhappen in the space of a handshake. Ciara keeps the oak sapling on her desk now, growing slowly in its crystal sphere, its tiny roots deepening, and its first leaves reaching toward the light. She tells me it reminds her every morning of what she almost lost, and what she will spend her life protecting. She tells me it reminds her that the strongest things in the universe grow slowly, from small and humble beginnings, and that the species who planted forests on a world they nearly burned to ash are the same species who plant gardens on space stations, and teach other people's children, and hold dying strangers' hands in the dark. She tells me she will never forget, and I believe her, because I have seen what happens to those who do.